Thrown down from the stage with her single carpetbag tossed after her into the dust, Ada Vance stood alone on the flat white expanse of Alkali Flat and watched the coach rattle away toward the horizon without once looking back. "I told you plain, miss," the driver had said, not unkindly but not kindly either. "Company don't carry passengers who can't pay the fare, no matter how sorry the circumstance. You can walk on to Merrick's Spread, it ain't but 4 miles, or you can wait for the next coach and hope the driver's softer-hearted than me." She had no coin left for waiting, and precious little dignity left for hoping, so she picked up her bag and started walking, the alkali dust rising white and bitter around her worn boot hems, the sun already merciless though it was scarcely mid-morning. She had left Missouri with what little her late father's creditors hadn't claimed, believing a teaching post awaited her in a town 2 days further west, only to learn from a fellow passenger that the position had been filled a month before she'd even set out, the letter of her acceptance lost somewhere in the slow tangle of the mail. Now she was a woman with no post, no family, and no fare, walking a dry road toward a name she'd only just heard, Merrick, with no notion of what she'd find there, or whether it would have any use for a stranded schoolteacher with empty pockets. She thought as she walked of the small, tidy house in Missouri where she had grown up believing herself secure, her father a respected merchant, her future a matter of quiet certainty, and of how quickly all of it had unraveled once his debts came due after his death, creditors descending like carrion birds on furniture and silver, and even in the end her mother's wedding ring. She had sold what she could, paid what she owed, and boarded the westbound stage with the last of her dignity and a bag of schoolbooks, telling herself that a woman with a sound education and a willingness to work could always find honest employment somewhere the world hadn't yet grown too crowded with judgment. She had not accounted for lost mail, or filled posts, or the particular cruelty of a country this vast and empty toward a woman traveling it alone. By the time an hour had passed on foot, her feet had blistered inside boots meant for parlors and church aisles, not for miles of hardpan clay, and she had begun to wonder, with a detachment that frightened her more than despair would have, whether a person could simply walk until they stopped being able to, and no one would ever know or care where they'd fallen. Quade Merrick was mending fence along the southern boundary of his spread when he first saw the small dark shape moving against the white glare of the flat, too far off yet to be more than a shadow, but wrong somehow in the way it moved, steady, but too steady, the walk of someone forcing themselves onward past the point their body wanted to stop. He set down his pliers and swung up onto his horse before he'd fully decided to investigate, some old instinct from his years riding line during the hard winters telling him that a lone figure walking the flat in this heat was not a sight a decent man rode past. He found her a half-mile on, swaying slightly, her bonnet gone somewhere behind her, her face burned pink along the nose and cheeks, her carpetbag dragging one shoulder down at an angle that spoke of arms gone past tired into trembling. She startled when his horse's shadow fell across her, and he saw her square her shoulders and lift her chin in the particular way of a woman bracing for trouble she had no strength left to fight. "Ma'am," he kept his voice easy, the way he'd gentle a spooked colt, and stayed mounted rather than loom over her on foot. "You've a fair walk ahead if you're bound anywhere on foot out here. Can I carry you the rest of the way, or fetch you water at the least?" She looked at him a long moment, at his weathered face, his plain range clothes, the calm patience in the way he waited without pressing, and something in her seemed to decide he was not, after all, another kind of danger. "I'd be grateful for the water," she said, "though I couldn't tell you rightly where I'm bound. I was put off the stage for want of fare, and told a Mr. Merrick's Spread lay some 4 miles on. I don't know the man or what use he'd have for me, only that it seemed a direction as good as any other in this country." Something moved in Quade's face, plain surprise giving way to something gentler. "You found him then, near enough. I'm Quade Merrick, and this is my range you're walking, though I'll confess I don't generally have young ladies delivered to me by way of the stage road." He swung down and offered his canteen, and did not ask, as she drank, the questions plainly written on his face: who she was, why she'd been left with no fare, what had brought her so far west with so little to show for the journey. "You needn't explain yourself to me, ma'am. A woman walking alone out here in this heat has earned a ride and a meal without an accounting first." Ada had braced herself, through the whole dusty walk, for a dozen unkind receptions for a rancher who'd see a penniless stranger and smell only trouble, for questions sharp enough to shame her into confessing every failure that had led her to this flat, empty road. She had not braced herself for a man who simply handed her water and lifted her carpetbag onto his saddle without asking a single thing in return. "You're very trusting of a stranger, Mr. Merrick," she said as they walked the last miles together, him leading his horse rather than riding while she recovered her strength on foot, an act of consideration she noticed and did not know quite how to thank him for. "For all you know, I could be running from the law myself." "Could be," he agreed easily. "But a woman running from the law don't generally walk it slow and straight down the middle of a public road in broad daylight, carrying a bag full of books instead of money. I looked in when I picked it up off the ground back yonder, didn't mean to pry, only wanted to be sure nothing important had spilled." A faint, apologetic look crossed his face. "Teacher's primers near as I could tell, and a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. That's not the baggage of a woman running from trouble. That's the baggage of a woman running towards something that didn't pan out the way she hoped." Ada felt her throat tighten unexpectedly at being so plainly, gently seen. "The position I was promised fell through before I ever reached it," she admitted. "I don't quite know what I'm running toward now. I only know I couldn't stay in Missouri, not after my father's debts took everything else worth keeping." "Then maybe you're not required to know just yet," he said. "Sandrock's a fair walk still. Come rest at my place tonight, eat a proper meal, and we'll sort the rest of it out once you're not swaying on your feet from the heat." His ranch house, when they reached it, was plain but well kept, a woman's absence evident in small, unfussed ways. No curtains at the windows, no flowers in the yard, the kind of bachelor order that spoke of a man managing well enough but managing alone. His housekeeper, an older widow named Mrs. Fenn who came in from town 3 days a week, fussed over Ada's sunburn and fed her a supper of stew and biscuits that tasted, to a woman who hadn't eaten proper since the previous morning, like the finest meal of her life. Mrs. Fenn took to Ada at once, in the brisk, assessing way of an older woman sizing up whether a stranger would prove trouble or treasure, and by the second evening she had pronounced her judgment plainly while the two of them washed dishes together at the basin. "Mr. Merrick's a good man," the housekeeper said, not looking up from the plate in her hands. "Gone too long without anyone to fuss over besides cattle and hired hands. I've watched him turn away 3 separate widows. The town tried to match him with these 2 years past, polite as Sunday but plain as a fence post about wanting none of it. And here he comes riding in with you on his arm like you were made of spun glass, asking after your comfort every 10 minutes since you arrived. I've known that man the better part of a decade, Miss Vance, and I've never once seen him fuss over a living soul the way he's fussing over you." Ada felt heat rise in her sunburned cheeks that had nothing to do with the day's walk. "He's only being kind to a stranded stranger, Mrs. Fenn. I wouldn't read more into a rancher's plain hospitality than the hospitality itself." "Wouldn't you?" Mrs. Fenn said, with the particular dry amusement of a woman who had seen a great deal more of the world than she generally let on, and said nothing further, though the knowing look she gave Ada across the dish basin stayed with her long after the older woman had gone home for the night. "You'll stay the week at least," Quaid said that evening, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands in a gesture Ada would come to recognize, over the following days, as the particular awkwardness of a plain-spoken man trying to be delicate about an offer he feared might be refused. "Not as charity, if that word troubles you. Mrs. Fenn could use the help with the mending and the accounts. My own hand at bookkeeping is poor enough that half my ledger's read like a foreign tongue, and I'd be glad of the company besides, if I'm honest about it. But you're free to go on to Frost Hollow whenever you've a mind. with fare enough in your pocket that you won't be put off another stage for want of it. She should have refused. Some proud, wounded part of her insisted. She had been raised to consider charity a kind of shame, and this offer, however gently made, still bore charity's shape beneath its practical dressing. But she had also been raised to recognize honest kindness when she met it, and she found, looking at this quiet man twisting his hat brim in the lamplight, that she had no wish at all to walk away from Alkali Flat so soon. "I accept," she said, "on the condition that you let me earn my keep in truth, not merely in the appearance of it. I may not know cattle, Mr. Merrick, but I can keep a ledger straight and a house running smooth, and I intend to prove it." The days that followed settled into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. Ada bent over his ledgers each morning, untangling years of muddled figures with the same patient precision she'd once brought to a classroom of unruly pupils, and Quade finding excuses, more often than strictly necessary, to come in from the range and consult her on some matter of accounts that could easily have waited until evening. She taught Mrs. Fenn's grandson his letters at the kitchen table some afternoons, and Quade took to lingering in the doorway to listen, something soft moving across his weathered face at the sound of her patient voice guiding a child through his alphabet. Quade took her into Sandrock one Saturday to see her properly outfitted for the country, sturdier boots, a wide-brimmed bonnet, gloves for the sun, insisting the whole while that it was simply good sense for a woman working his accounts to be comfortable doing it, though the care he took choosing the color of her bonnet ribbon suggested a motive less practical than he claimed. The town's women watched them walk the boardwalk together with open curiosity, and Ada braced herself once more for the sting of gossip, but found instead that Quade Merrick's plain, unhurried courtesy toward her seemed to answer every unspoken question before it could be asked unkindly. He was a well-liked man in Sandrock, respected for fair dealing and a steady hand, and whatever the town made of the stranded schoolteacher he'd taken in, it made it, for the most part, kindly. "They'll talk regardless," he told her afterward, as they drove the wagon back toward the ranch with her new boots still stiff on her feet. "Folks in a small country always will. I've found the surest way to quiet unkind talk is to give them nothing shameful to talk about, and plenty of plain decency instead. Let them see you're welcome at my table and treated with respect, and most of the ugliness dies of its own accord." "You've clearly given this some thought," Ada said, watching him rather than the road. "I've had reason to," he admitted, and did not elaborate further, though the color that rose along his sun-browned neck told her plainly enough what reason he meant. It was a full month before either of them named plainly what had grown between them, and it took a crisis to force the naming. A grass fire broke fast and wild across the southern range one dry evening, driven by a hot wind that turned a small careless spark into a wall of flame racing toward the home pasture and the barn beyond it, and Quade was out among his hands fighting it with wet sacks and backfires long past dark, his face and hands blackened with smoke, his lungs raw from the effort. Ada did not wait at the house wringing her hands the way propriety might have suggested. She rode out with water and clean cloth in her own two capable hands, working the line alongside the ranch hands until the fire finally guttered and died at the edge of a plowed firebreak an hour before dawn, the barn and house saved by inches and exhaustion. She had never in her life worked so hard nor been so afraid, hauling water sacks until her arms screamed and beating at low flames with a wet blanket, until her palms blistered anew beneath the gloves Quade had bought her. But she had not once considered turning back toward the house to wait in safety, while the man who had taken her in without question fought for everything he owned. When the flames finally died, and the exhausted line of men and one determined woman stood surveying the blackened, smoking ground that had, an hour before, threatened to take everything, she felt a fierce, unfamiliar pride settle into her chest alongside the exhaustion, the pride of having belonged, fully and usefully, to a place and its peril. She found Quade afterward sitting against the corral fence, spent past speaking, and knelt beside him to wipe the soot from his face and check his hands for burns with the same steady care she'd have given any pupil in her charge. And it was there, in the gray hour before sunrise with the smell of smoke still hanging thick over the flat, that he finally said what he'd been carrying silent for weeks. "I never asked you a single question that first day," he said, "because I didn't want an answer that might send you off again before I'd had the chance to know you properly. I've been half in love with you since you told me you didn't know what you were running toward, Ada, because I knew what I wanted you to be running toward even then. I wanted to be here. I wanted to be me." Ada sat back on her heels, soot-streaked and exhausted, and more certain of anything than she had been in the whole long, hard year since her father's death. "I was thrown off a stage in the middle of nowhere with nothing to my name but a bag of books and a bundle of old letters," she said, "and you found me and didn't ask a single question, and gave me a place to be useful before you ever asked to be loved in return. I think I've been running toward exactly this since the moment your shadow fell over that road, Quade Merrick. I simply didn't have the courage to say so until you did." He kissed her then, gently, tasting of smoke and the long night's fear, and when he pulled back he was smiling in a way she hadn't yet seen on his careful, weathered face. "Then stay," he said. "Not as a bookkeeper, and not as charity, and not because a coach put you off in my country with nowhere else to go. Stay because I'm asking you plainly, in front of God and this burned-over pasture, to be my wife." They were married before the summer's end, in the small church at Sandrock with Mrs. Fenn weeping happily in the front pew, and Ada Merrick kept the ranch's books for 40 years after, though she never again let her husband forget that she had arrived at his door with nothing but a bag of primers and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had refused to stop walking, even when the whole world seemed determined to put her down in the middle of nowhere and leave her there.